So Grab has laid off 10% of the workforce, which is a very sizable dynamic because I think historically over this time period, they've been letting people leave and they haven't been adding people. So effectively a hiring freeze. And so that's been a way for them to kind of like tighten expenses and so forth. But now they decided to cut another 10%. I think they've done a pretty good job, at least in terms of the communications, right? Like no one's surprised about layoffs now in this crisis on tech winter. So it's just another company's layoff. And since then, I think their stock market price has jumped by another 5-6%, right, after the announcement. So shareholders are appreciative of this move. Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 20,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Poland is a private B2B liquidation marketplace. The startup connects sellers carrying excess inventory with bulk buyers across the world. The platform incorporates pricing algorithms, dashboard analytics, and sustainability metrics to find great liquidation outcomes. Hundreds of tons of usable products that would have been incinerated or gone to landfill is now used by happy consumers instead. Manufacturers get more revenue, buyers get cheaper inventory, and the world benefits. Learn more at www.poland.tech. Hey, morning, Shiyan.
It's morning for me. It's 6 a.m.
Yep, 9 p.m. for me here. But, we make it work every week. Shout out to AK Manon, obviously an old friend calling in from Boston. And he said that he enjoys the podcast episodes, especially with you, Shiyan. Yeah, there we go. Our first American, listener, So it's interesting times.
I continue to be like mildly horrified that people listen to us talk.
Our speculations and hypotheses makes us and wild ass guesses to the future.
Well, we better put on a good show, Jeremy.
I know, right? So I think there's 3 things. I think first of all is the Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg Cagematch. Secondly is the Grab layoffs and the GoJek layoffs in the context of that. And lastly, of course, is the Straits Times, the Singapore Press Holdings audit report has just come out, some final findings after our previous discussion about them for the circulation scandal/crisis. So yeah, but let's go off first. Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, what do you think about that Cagematch that they threw at each other on Twitter?
First of all, ridiculous. Second of all, my money's on Zuck.
Gotta explain why. What's your money on Zuck?
He's younger. He's been posting videos of his jujitsu training.
True. That's a very good set of moves.
I think he won a local match recently. I don't know, per social media. And I feel like I saw some report about him completing the Murph workout in under 40 minutes, which seems pretty impressive. But I don't know. What is this? Midlife crisis. People go find new hobbies and start like challenging other billionaires to prove that they're still young and virile. Like, I don't know what's going on. Can I just say that 2 women would never do this? Like 2 female CEOs would never challenge each other to a cage match on Twitter. This is just absurd.
Sorry, that's so funny. This is like, suddenly reminded me of like Zoolander, right? A little bit like there's all these like competitions about who's better and so forth. Yeah, I gotta say, you're right. I think Mark Zuckerberg has the grapple game and it's really important. It's not just about punching and so forth, but I don't know. I think there's some like energy with Elon Musk, I gotta say. He's got that, I don't know. He might have that killer instinct, I think.
I feel like he grew up in South Africa and there was some silly report about like, oh, he was in street fights as a kid. And I'm like, really? I don't know if I believe that. He has been looking fitter recently.
Much
I don't know
fitter
if you
recently.
look from photos. And there was a tweet about this. So people were like, oh, what's happening? And he's like, oh, fasting. And
Yeah.
then, like, a few tweets later, he's like, "And Wegovy," which is
Yeah.
the GLP-1 drug that helps people with diabetes, but also has a side effect of weight loss. So maybe he's trying to get to fighting weight in anticipation of this cage match. Unclear.
I mean, think about it. I mean, they tell each other and say, like, look, let's obviously give each other 6 months or a year, get a hype up. I mean, come on, like Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, everyone's gonna be buzzing. It's gonna be like the match of the, I don't know, I wouldn't say century, but the decade, right? I think everybody's gonna be watching it. I don't know. Then they throw in TikTok CEO as
Oh
well.
my god.
So, I'm just saying, like, just throw in all the social media CEOs by as well, right? And then, you know.
Like, you should put them on teams. Are you getting the Snapchat CEO as well? And then
Oh, Ever Spiegel, there we go.
oh my god.
That'd be so great. Like,
Oh
oh
my
my
god.
gosh. But I think that's obviously the beef, right? Because I think Elon Musk was kind of flagging up that Mark Zuckerberg had recently spoken at town hall that they want to launch a Twitter competitor, right? Because they felt like there's an opportunity. They want to move their social graph from Instagram. So I think there is actually, I mean, it's not just like a let's fight for fight's sake, but it's also like, hey, I think there's a sense that I think everybody's trying to get competitive, right? Because of, I don't know, like AI, right? Everybody's trying to do AI. Both sides have their own thesis on AI. Now they're both doing social networks. So I think that, I don't know what's the word, that piece is now changing to like the encroachment into each other's boundaries. So it's going to be an interesting challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, man. It's kind of an interesting question, right? Do you think Facebook can build a Twitter competitor and succeed? And secondly, like, is this a good use of their time relative to all the other opportunities in front of them?
Mm. Yeah, but I think that in the sense of opportunity, right, which is that the Twitter advertisers have mostly kind of like jumped, right? Now, obviously, it's a membership structure. So I think there's opportunities to pick off more of the advertising budget that Facebook and Meta needs, right? So it
Yeah.
feels like there's more like taking opportunity, which I can imagine Elon Musk isn't happy about, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I buy that, right? Which is that they have a much better ad system and that has powered like both Facebook and Instagram. And
Right.
that's a huge asset, right? Which is that an advertiser could go in and basically have access to lots of different types of segments and audiences. So that makes sense to me. But like, I don't know. Like they just haven't really launched a product that's been successful, right? All the big successes have come through acquisition, right? So
Oh,
Instagram,
buy
WhatsApp,
Twitter.
Oculus. I don't know if you want that either. I mean, it seems like a dumpster fire right now, but
I think
yeah,
there's
it's an interesting question.
I mean, Twitter does look like, I think there's a lot of analysis saying that they hit it potentially towards bankruptcy to help reorganize the debts, the interest payments, and so forth. So it's not impossible that at that point of time, there's going to be another reset conversation to be like, okay, what's the new Twitter, I guess, version 3 is going to be.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's crazy.
Yeah.
So what's the Southeast Asia equivalent of the Zuck Elon cage match? Like who would you put in a ring against each other?
I can't think of, no, I can't think of any. I mean, I think overall, I just feel like Southeast Asian CEOs and founders have been a lot more like focused on obviously their companies and the businesses and haven't really been public about any personality or encroach even into the media space, right? That being said, I think that brings us nicely to the second chapter, right? Which is talking about the Grab and GoJek layoffs, right? So Grab has laid off 10% of the workforce, which is a very sizable dynamic because I think historically over this time period, they've been letting people leave and they haven't been adding people. So effectively a hiring freeze. And so that's been a way for them to kind of like tighten expenses and so forth. But now they decided to cut another 10%, right? And so that's quite an interesting piece. But from what I've seen as well, I think they've done a pretty good job, at least in terms of the communications, right? I think they've done a good job announcing severance, counseling services, LinkedIn subscription to help find a new job. So I felt like the communications of it was like done straightforward. And we talked about it, right? Like no one's surprised about layoffs now in this crisis on tech winter. So it's just another company's layoff. And since then, I think their stock market price has jumped by another 5-6%, right, after the announcement. So shareholders are appreciative of this move.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've said this before, right? There's no great layoff, but there's a lot of ways to do layoff badly. And I think from an execution perspective, it was probably like pretty well handled. I think the question is like, they did a small cut, I think, in 2020 and then held off until now. And I think Gojek did one last year and then one this year, right? And I think in general, we see this and it's hard, but people just never cut enough the first time. And it's often more demoralizing to have successive cuts than have one big cut. But I mean, I guess for Grab, these two were like far enough apart that maybe they thought they could pull it together and just with natural attrition and a hiring freeze kind of get to where they needed to. But yeah, I don't know. I think it just seems like you should try to do these things faster. And so now then the question is, do the people who are left start looking because they're like, maybe there's going to be another cut coming? Or do they feel reassured that like, hey, we're going to reach adjusted EBITDA profitability? I haven't looked deeply into the adjustments and like what how real this EBITDA number is by Q4, I guess is the claim.
Yeah. Yep, that's a claim. And I think it's doable. I think they have a quite sizable cash reserve after their public listing. So I think they also have some flex as well in terms of their timeline as well. So I think the buffer is much more, I think, stable, I think, as compared to Gojek, I think, who has, I think, more capital requirements that they are out on the market for, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see how they also both, I think, make decisions about the various markets they're in as they compete. Are they going to consolidate? Are they going to kind of like streamline? So it's quite interesting to see. How do you think this compares, obviously, with the other big tech companies? They have Facebook, obviously, and Meta and Google had multiple rounds of layoffs, which was a huge dynamic, right? Obviously, I think we see Uber and Didi, for example, around the world. How do you see this comparing against other business models and benchmarks?
I mean, I'm frankly surprised they didn't do it sooner. Right? I think like everyone has been engaged in a big everyone who's burning has been engaged like in a big exercise to get to profitability as they see the capital markets are no longer as forgiving of the unprofitable growth model. I think for Facebook and Google and the rest it's a little bit different. Like they're not unprofitable, right? They're in fact hugely profitable, but it's more that, people are looking at expenses and maybe slowing revenue growth and increased competition on the AI front and being like, well, what are these guys doing? And they are realizing also that they had built up layers of bureaucracy that were slowing down their decision making and limiting their ability to compete effectively. And so I think those were made less a financial necessity and more out of the realizations like, hey, kind of, we have too many people here for kind of the output that we're delivering. Why don't we try to get to fighting weight?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to see also where the cuts are going to, right? So I think recruiters have been cut a lot, obviously, because if you're firing people, you're not really hiring. So a lot of recruiters are out in space. I think it's been interesting to see, for example, Indeed actually laid off their entire engineering team in Singapore, which was a big, big, big surprise actually for many folks, right? Because they had spent quite a lot of time and money and sweat, honestly, to build out that engineering capability in Singapore and just kind of like close it pretty much all down, which was quite dramatic from my perspective. Yeah, not easy.
Yeah. No easy answers. But yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about this before, right? Just like when things are good, people tend to overhire and you don't notice it because growth kind of masks a lot of sins. And then, when things turn, you end up cutting. I think the one notable exception is Apple, right? Apple hasn't laid off, and partially it's
True.
like Apple didn't grow as fast. If you look at all
Yeah.
the headcount numbers. And so I think that kind of operational discipline is actually pretty impressive because people's tendency is to want to build their own fiefdoms, and that usually comes with adding more headcount.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also to do with like Apple probably has had actually a longer operating history, right, as a firm, right, than a lot of companies like Google and Facebook. Like even like I remember after the great financial crisis in 2008, right, then they started hiring. Before that, it was relatively streamlined and you didn't really kind of like suffer. So I think it's an interesting dynamic where I think some of the funds with that I don't know, history of going through multiple boom and bust cycles actually has started to be like, okay, how do we stay like you said, disciplined in the good times, but also during the bad times?
I don't know, man. Even McKinsey ran layoffs.
Oh
McKinsey's been
yeah.
around for a long time, but you saw their headcount balloon.
Yeah.
You saw their headcount balloon kind of in the last 3 years as well before they did the
Yeah.
layoffs.
Yeah. Well,
Um, and banks are
yeah.
notorious at this, right?
Yeah.
In good times, they always overhire, and then when the downturn comes, they cut. So
I mean, yeah, man, it's such a rough time, honestly. But yeah, where are you starting to see people? Actually, I'm starting to see folks who have been laid off in the first wave. I'm starting to see them at their new jobs now, actually. So I've seen them in marketing consultancies. I've seen them at freelancing. I've seen them at larger companies, tier two, tier three companies. So that's what I've seen. Where else have you seen the people head towards?
yeah, I mean, I haven't. That's pretty consistent, I think. I think because I hang out with founders, like they're not firing themselves, so I'm a bit not tracking that as closely. But yeah, I mean, the few that I have seen probably end up freelancing. And I think if you are sort of like a designer or an engineer or a marketer, it's actually a skill that is pretty in demand. It might not be like at a company full-time role, but people are always looking for projects to be done, and you can kind of hustle stuff together. And who knows, like maybe people find that independence and that agency really fun and they turn it into something, or they use it as a time to like workshop ideas and think about other things.
Yeah. We discussed that the previous time, right? Which is we gave advice about how to handle if you were laid off, how there's light at the end of the tunnel, and how to kind of like navigate the skill sets that's needed. So for folks who are listening, they can obviously check out that previous episode. But has your thinking evolved between that last episode, which was several months ago, to today? Obviously, we've seen more layoffs since then. We've also seen the market start to change.
No, I think it's pretty much kind of where we were a couple months ago, right? I mean, there continues to be full employment in Singapore. There are still jobs, people are hiring, so I think there's this sort of like, do you take sort of something that wasn't necessarily your dream job, or do you think about like different versions of how your skills can be applied and just kind of be open to new opportunities?
Right.
Or do you like take a bit of time off and sort of regroup and think about, do you want to do something independent? So, I mean, I think the one good thing about Singapore is I think most people, their costs aren't totally out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And so getting laid off is not necessarily like as traumatic. Whereas I think like often in the Bay Area, like people's housing costs are very high. And so it can be quite challenging to stay if you're not getting paid. And then that leads to kind of like more dislocation.
That is something that I do think that's different, which is that I've had a lot of folks who are obviously thinking about jobs between the US or Southeast Asia. And obviously, up till 2 years ago, right? I think a lot of folks were like, I want to be an employee in America. It was very straightforward. But I think I've met about two folks who are kind of like students. And for them, it's like they're very concerned because there aren't jobs actually in the Bay Area for them, even though they want to stay in the Bay Area, right? And so they're thinking about returning to Indonesia or to Singapore and having that conversation. So that was an interesting dynamic. And you reminded me actually of my own experience back in 2011, right? It was like that decision between East and West, and kind of like the 2008 financial crisis was pretty bad. And I mean, thankfully, I didn't graduate in 2008, but I think a lot of folks who graduated in 2008 really struggled because of that great financial crisis in the US. So,
Yeah. When there's a downturn, they're less likely to hire foreigners, right? They're going to hire Americans first.
yeah,
And there's just fewer jobs. But
yeah.
it could lead to like different things. So I don't know. I mean, I think it doesn't feel this way necessarily, but like if you graduated from college in the US, you're like a pretty competent person, right? Like you're actually like highly skilled, and there's many places you can apply your skills.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it might not be exactly in the spot that you thought, but Like, I think one thing you end up learning is, like, there's so many different industries and professions that you had never really thought about or knew
Yeah.
existed,
Yeah.
and you kinda have to be open to exploring them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the. What were you like? I mean, when you graduated, I'm so curious. How did you make a decision about your job?
Oh, I mean, I graduated in a boom time, right? So it's a little bit different, but I had a summer internship, and that turned into a full-time offer, and I had enjoyed my summer internship, and so when they said, "Do you wanna come back full-time the following year?" I was like, "Yeah, this sounds great." But, I mean, I probably could have benefited from a broader job search. I mean, I had a great time. I was an investment banking analyst at JP Morgan, like, not particularly earth-shattering, but I think if I were to, like, go back and advise my 21-year-old self, I think I would have challenged myself to, like, do a broader search and explore more things because, yeah, there's just so many other things out there to do. So,
Mm.
you don't necessarily have to go down this sort of straight and narrow path kinda right out of the gate.
Yeah. There was actually this interesting paper I remember now that said that if you graduated during a downturn, your lifetime earnings is like some percentage lower. I don't know the exact number, so I'm not going to say it. So I'll probably just link to it in the transcript here. But it was kind of an interesting analysis, which is that your because your first job salary, then you kind of get increments of that job, right? A second, third, fourth job. And so there's an interesting cohort effect where if you graduate in a downturn, you're always like one pound smaller, right? In terms of your total comp, which is, I think, a tragedy for a lot of folks in this current situation in the tech space. Obviously, I think if you're in different verticals like hospitality or communications, I think there's a lot of jobs that are still available to you. But it's interesting to see that tech side suddenly lose that shine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why some people delay graduation, right? If they feel like the market's not good, they're like, "Okay, I'm gonna get a master's, try to delay and, like, graduate into a better job market." I don't know if the math of that actually works out, though. I'm kind of curious. I don't know if anyone's done research on that.
Like, what is the game theory behind what's the optimal path? I don't know. I think we saw that actually in China, right? Because there's such strict pandemic, what's the word, controls that a lot of students actually end up doing master's programs. And that's why there's a huge graduation cohort this year. And I think the central government is struggling to find jobs for all these university students, actually. So it's kind of interesting change on the Chinese model.
We'll see if it unleashes a wave of entrepreneurship in China.
I guess so. I think maybe. I don't know, actually. Actually, I've noticed a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs who are in Singapore now because they feel like they can be entrepreneurial in China, but they don't feel like they're going to be rewarded with the success of entrepreneurship, right? And they have know people who have been arrested before they went public, or they have heard stories or alumni who have gone through that situation. And so I think a lot of that entrepreneurship, like pathing, right, is just like kind of like broken as a end step, right, for a lot of folks. So it's kind of interesting to hear their
I don't
personal
know. I mean,
stories.
I think
Yeah.
the pendulum is swinging back. I did see an interesting stat. I'll have to find it. That it's actually easier to go public in China than it is in the US or Hong Kong markets. So there's like a lower revenue threshold. And the other sort of dynamic is that the Chinese retail investor is creating demand for IPOs because there's limits on how much money they
Mm,
can take out of the country. I think it's like
right.
50K. And then they also put a cap on how many houses they can buy. So traditionally,
Right.
like real estate is like the target for investment. And so that money needs to go somewhere and it ends up flowing into the stock markets. And so I think if you look at the last year of IPOs, right, the ones listed in China, whether it's on the main or starboard, have outperformed the Hong Kong and US IPOs of Chinese companies. So I don't know. I thought that was an interesting data point.
Well, I think it ties on to like our previous episode. We discussed kind of like Sequoia China's spinning to Hongshan and there being lots of financial reward, right, for the Chinese market, both on the domestic but also on a global listing approach. On that note, I cannot help but say that I've also did my research on botanical species, and Hongshan, it means Redwoods, and Sequoia is one of the Redwoods, but there are three Redwoods. So, so
Thank you
we'll
for this
we'll
incredibly pedantic clarification, Jeremy.
I just want to say that we were both right. That's what I'm just trying to say here. Okay, we were both right. I just want to kind of correct it for the record. Well, this came out organically, but it was rattling around my brain a little bit. Okay. So on that note, I think we're also talking a little bit about what we want to cover was the Straits Times and Singapore Press Holdings. There was that previous episode where we discussed that there was an issue where there was, let's say, potential fraud at that point of time, alleged, of about 10 to 12% of the total circulation numbers for the Straits Times. And that was discovered. And then what we have now is that the internal committee has now released that report. And they kind of like talk about in very specific details about how the numbers came about, how it was done. I think to some extent the knowledge that people had about the various programs. But they also, I think, removed the names of the various individuals. And they said that they are decided to refer the case to the police. So I think those are interesting set of findings. I think you and I reviewed it. What jumped out at you, Shiyan? Yeah.
I mean, it just confirmed, I think, that like people were knowingly doing it. So there's this whole section about like they called it Avatar. I thought that was pretty funny. And
Yeah,
it
it
was
is.
commonly known that Avatar meant these like fictitious copies that again got sent to the Kaki Bukit warehouse and like destroyed. And I don't know, the whole thing just seemed a bit ridiculous to me. Like, yeah, nobody like sort of like, whoops, I accidentally destroyed repeatedly thousands of copies of newspaper. Like, obviously, it was deliberate. So, I mean, I'm glad they did the report. I appreciate the transparency. They said management was aware of it. There were a couple instances where they were like, "Oh, but no one at the board was aware of it." So management was concealing it from the board. But I kind of worry that at the end of the day, they're just gonna like charge some low-level circulation employee when clearly that person wouldn't have done it without a bad set of incentives set by a senior person. But like they've turned over the whole senior team, right? At this point with the takeover. And so it's like, who is gonna be held accountable for this? Not to mention, like, the separate fact, right, which is, like, they're taking, what, like, $1 billion sharehold of taxpayer money to fund this media enterprise, and I don't know, do you feel like you're getting $1 billion worth of value, Jeremy, as a Singaporean taxpayer?
Well, I mean, it's like the BBC, right? I think there is space for government, the linked media, and you can call this a charity, a nonprofit, public trust. But I think the concept of NPR, for example, like some
Yeah, but the
level of,
BBC's good. So's
I think there's
NPR.
a lot of British people who are very angry with the BBC because of their supposed or possible or alleged bias or slant or boring. So I think a lot of people are quite frustrated.
I just feel like we are capable of doing better. Sometimes you read the newspaper and it's like, "Is this a press release?" Like,
But I enjoy my lunch with Sumikyo Tan. That's I always read it.
does that still exist?
It still exists. It's always such a pleasing read. I don't know, I feel like I've been reading it since I don't know from forever. I don't know. I feel like one of those old people who open up the Sunday copy and just go through all the comics. And I don't know. I'm one of those old people who like print on Sundays.
Oh my god, I can't remember when the last time I had a printed newspaper was.
I don't know. It's so soothing. You open up, you open your breakfast, and then you negotiate with your family members. Who gets which copy to go first. Ah,
That's quaint. That's quaint. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't super surprised. I guess I'm glad that they
yeah,
released it and it was transparent. But I don't know, you read it and you just feel a little bit sad, right? Like,
yeah,
I don't they did redact the names, but it's like you couldn't possibly have thought you were doing the right thing.
yeah. I mean, some of these programs felt like more like understandable, right? I think there were like what 8 different ways. I think of the ways that circulation got boosted, and I think some of them were like barter, and it felt like I think it was conceived with a good intention, but then at some point, like you said, the incentives got warped, and then people made a wrong decision and it kept it going. Even though I think for one example they had was they knew that most people are not accessing the thing, right? The digital subscription, because they're the numbers, but then they counted a digital subscription the same way they count like print, right? Which is like, if I submitted the print to you, that's circulation, right? Therefore, if I sent out a code and you never used it, it's also counted. So I don't know. I was like looking at this and I was like, yeah, like out of all the programs, I think Avatar is by far the worst, right? Worst, right? Which is like they flat out knew that it's going to warehouse and then it gets destroyed and recycled, right? I think that's like worst. And then there's a bunch of other programs. But I think there were other programs. I think there was like, I think there were other clients that paid money. There was also a link to, I think, a fund, internal fund for charitable donations. And it just felt at some point, I was just like, yeah, at some point it was just like systematic, which was so disappointing. But I think I feel relief actually, because I think there's a lot of detail in the report. I don't know. I actually enjoyed reading the whole thing and felt like, okay, at least they're transparent. At least they say it out loud. They say all these other things.
Yeah.
I feel like there can't be more bad news, hopefully. Fingers crossed, touch wood here. Like, at least I think they're very clear about how everything happened, right? From my perspective.
Yeah, so I agree, right? Which is like, I value the transparency. I don't know if it was fun to read. You need new hobbies, Jeremy. But yeah, I mean, at least it wasn't swept under the rug. And then now I think the question is like, who's going to be held accountable? And like, does that actually change the behavior of the organization? Like, they made a bunch of
Of
recommendations
course,
about.
it will change the incentives of the organization. You're going to send people to get charged. You have a whole report. I think people will change about how they circulate the numbers and how they audit the numbers for at minimum.
Sure. Is it going to lead to a better product?
That's a different thing, right? That's a different, I don't know. I think you got to clean up the house first, right? And then you can go paint the facade and make it all nice, right? I think,
Fair enough.
yeah, at least that would be my impression: is fix this first, get the foundations in, and then they can focus on fixing the product, right? I don't know. That's my hope, I guess.
Yep. Yep.
What do you read these days, actually, Shiyan? I'm so curious.
What do I
So,
read?
yeah.
I've been trying to read a lot of the AI papers that are being published to try to get a better understanding of the
Yeah. Wow.
progress in the field. Yeah, I mean, and I read the FT, the Wall Street Journal,
Hmm.
like the standard stuff,
Yeah.
the information.
Right.
But yeah, I don't read. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've read anything physical.
Interesting. I think I read The Economist, physical and digital. So that's been interesting. It feels like a slower pace of news. And I try very hard to block Google News and all these like daily news stuff because they kind of get to me and there's just so much information. I also read, I think, like you said, The Information, The Can, Asia Tech Review, right, with John Russell. And I think there's some interesting stuff actually on Substack, actually. So I follow them on RSS, right?
Oh yeah,
So, yeah,
there's a ton of Substack. It's
yeah,
hard to stay on top of.
yeah,
I'm trying Feedly on the recommendation of a friend,
yeah.
and it's supposed to kind of like learn and like serve you stuff, but also able to take your subscriptions in. Oh, I like Stratechery.
Oh yeah, great read. Very dense though. So I always had
Yeah,
to kind
but
of
I
like
love
sit
it.
down.
And he's
Yeah,
so consistent
yeah,
on his reporting, so I think it's excellent. And you can consume it in a podcast format. You don't have to read it because he has like a thing where he'll just read his daily update. So I think that's good. And then I actually like podcasts for like longer form stuff. So
mm,
when they do sort of like deep dives or interviews, like Ben Thompson does it with CEOs,
mm,
Acquired does it with companies, Lex Friedman does it. So I think those are also excellent.
yeah. I find myself actually consuming a lot on YouTube these days. So like infographic, cartoon animated explainer videos seems to be my preferred, I don't know, input. So on like biology, on economics, it just seems to be like they take the work to summarize it, right? And then they put the infographics. So it's just, I don't know, it clicks better for me in my brain. And also, I mean, been reading a lot on Kindle as well, obviously. So I think the issue is that's like information diet is just like, yeah, Straits Times is competing with this, right? I don't know. It's a tough job for like a national newspaper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Glad it's not my job.
Okay, well, I'm gonna still support the Straits Times. I hope they pull through, and I hope they keep running Lunch with Sumiko.
They have $1
I don't know.
billion, Jeremy. I think Lunch with Sumiko Town is safe.
Yeah. 10 more years. What? 6 seasons in a movie for Lunch with Sumiko. On that note, I'd love to kind of like summarize the three big conversations that we had. I think the
Sure.
first, of course, was Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg,
Zuck.
and sounds like you're betting on Zuck. So
Who are you betting on? Are you betting on Elon?
I'll bet on Elon if there's a 6 months kind of like lead up, which I believe will happen, right? So, and I believe it will be the media event of the year or the
Oh
decade.
my god.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, like, everyone be live streaming, everybody be watching. I don't know. I don't know what the media teams are thinking about. You never know; it could happen, right? And they put the proceedings to charity, right? And then it's a bit of fun and everything. You can see that happening. And then the second thing, of course, we talked about is the Grab and GoJek layoffs, and we
Yeah.
talked about how the timing and how we think there's a lot of impact for folks and how to handle it. And lastly, I think we talked about the Singapore Press Holdings, the final findings of the report. And I think it was interesting to hear your point of view about how I think it's good to see the detail, and hopefully it's time for a new chapter. All right. See you, Shiyan.
Okay. Good work. Take it easy, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.